Hi, this is either the second, third, or fourth part of this video, so you don't necessarily have to watch all four parts, but if you want to, here is your warning. This is not the first part. Links in the description for all four videos, hopefully.
But yes, I think the other thing you said that you had or you were making a list of these pre-Kinsey works which could have asexual representation.
Yes. When I was at the conference, we had a Q&A session after the presentation, and probably the biggest question that people had were, could you recommend some works? And so I've been kind of toying around with a list of possible asexual characters. Not all of them are pre-Kinseyan. I think I've got a couple on here who are post, or in the case of one, actually kind of straddles both the pre and post. So
Yeah.
It's a wide variety. There are a lot of genres here. So really, there's something for everyone. And I've posted it on my website, and I'll be adding to it as I continue my research. But right now, I've got maybe 8 characters on the list and 2 authors that are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But the first, I think, and probably the most canonically asexual is Jughead Jones.
Yes. Yeah.
He's clearly asexual. He says he's asexual. He has an interesting narrative. But the fascinating thing about Jughead Jones is you can go back to his first appearance back in 1941, I think, 1942, and read his character arc in that first issue, and he checks off so many boxes on what how you would represent an asexual character in the comics. For example, all the characters in that first issue of Archie, where Archie makes his first appearance, they have very rounded eyes. Jughead, on the other hand, his eyes are just sort of slits, indicating that he sees things from a different perspective. He sees this, he is fundamentally different than all the other characters in the book, and that plays out throughout his narrative. So Jughead Jones is a really good example because you can say this character is asexual canonically.
Yes.
Without a doubt, he is asexual. And then go back and look at those pre-Kinsey study issues and really dig in and kind of develop a concept of, does this character exhibit asexuality in these issues? So he is a really interesting study. The next on the list is Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
Very commonly referred to as asexual. I would also argue as aromantic. Unfortunately, the media very frequently portrays him as having romantic attractions and having sexual attractions, and that sort of erases the opportunity for people to explore an asexual character. And that's really unfortunate because he has such a rich history of this sort of asexual behavior that we could identify. But people aren't going to dig into that because they watched a Robert Downey Jr. adaptation, and he's in love with this character, and he's upset that she's died, and it's frustrating.
It's I find I have that problem with the character, obviously, but also the way, from what I haven't actually really watched many adaptations of it, but the way other characters seem to act around him, they seem to see him, because of that lack of romantic or sexual attraction, they see him as cold or calculating, which, I mean, people in real life will do as well, but I don't think that's necessarily a healthy way to portray people around an asexual or aromantic person.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. And I also think that there's something to be said about the concept of Sherlock Holmes being autistic in that in how he relates to people. Because that is a debate to be had, but at the same point in time, it sort of negates the concept that he could be asexual. Like maybe he treats people this way because he's asexual and aromantic, uh, rather than it just being him autistic, of being somewhere on that autism spectrum. Uh, so that is an interesting debate to be had as well. So the question would then be, could he be not only on the autism spectrum, but could he also be representative of asexuality simultaneously? And to consider both at the same time would be, I think, an effective means of analyzing his character.
No, definitely, especially since there's a wide variety of neurodiversity within the ACE community as well. As in the ACE conference in Edinburgh, there was a panel on neurodiversity in the ACE community. So yeah, and similarly to how Sherlock Holmes' asexuality has been erased in some adaptations of him, the same happened to Jughead, which is very annoying because they did that. I think it was a Netflix Riverdale series.
Yeah, Riverdale. Yeah. And he's heterosexual now, I think.
Yeah, despite the character, like you said, having been from the very start a completely asexual character.
Yeah. I will admit, though, it was very inspiring when they announced that, and so many people came out outraged that they would alter a fundamental aspect of Jughead like that. It was really... It kind of made me feel like, hey, these are people, they're not necessarily in the ACE community, but they're allies.
Yes.
And that connection is what's going to make the difference going forward. So that was inspiring. You didn't get that with all these adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. Partially, I think, because he's not canonically asexual.
Yeah.
But also partly because a lot of those adaptations occurred, in the early 2000s and the 90s and prior, where people weren't necessarily concerned about asexual orientation. I remember Dan Savage laughing at the idea of asexuals marching in a pride parade. I mean, this is the president of the Human Rights Council, so who are supposed to be fighting for LGBTQIA rights, and here he is laughing at the A.
Yeah. Was there more you wanted to go over?
Sure. Well, we'd already... the next two are Sir Galahad and Candide, whom we've already kind of gone over. And then I've got one from post-Kinsey here. Rorschach, Walter Kovacs from The Watchmen. He takes a really interesting approach to sexuality. He is very antagonistic toward the idea. Generally, people who have sex he looks at them with distaste, and often calls them whores and other less than flattering terms. So he takes a very almost militaristic approach towards it. So within that regard, Rorschach could be a really interesting study in an asexual character. I have never known an asexual person to be that antagonistic toward people who have sex, but there may very well be someone out there who does. So that's something to consider.
No,
Uh,
I definitely think there's oh, like there's obviously a spectrum of asexuality, but there's also a spectrum of sorts of attitudes towards sex
yeah,
within the ace community, whether you're um, disgusted by it or well, sex repulsed, sex averse, or sex indifferent, all those things. Um, but normally, when you get to the negative side of the spectrum, it isn't "I don't like you because you're having sex." It's more "I don't want anything to do with it." Um, so that definitely would be an interesting character to explore.
yeah. I think there's one of my favorite young adult series
Hmm.
is the Lady Trent memoirs.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with them. The first one is A Natural History of Dragons. It's kind of a fantasy sci-fi story that takes place in a Victorian world.
Okay.
Uh, and because it takes place in this Victorian sort of universe, you get that aspect of a character being forced into a relationship she doesn't really want to be in.
Yeah.
So I would argue that Lady Trent, the main character, is asexual because she doesn't seem to exhibit any sort of sexual attraction or sexual desire in any way, shape, or form. She
Yep.
doesn't have any kids, uh, but I think she's also potentially demi-romantic
Hmm.
uh, because she does. While her romantic attraction to her husband is not necessarily what we would call romantic in the traditional sense,
Yeah.
it is romantic to her.
Hmm.
So I think from her perspective, she does love this one person, but she has no real romantic feelings toward anyone else. Uh, so that's an interesting character to dig into. There are also other characters in the series who also exhibit asexual tendencies.
Hmm.
So that's a really interesting series to read. Um, so if you know some of your viewers are fantasy fans, you know that would be a fun read,
Well, I am,
particularly
so
for young women, because the whole narrative is empowering for young girls who want to get into science.
hmm.
Uh, because that's one of the major obstacles that the main character has to overcome. She loves science, but she is expected to go be a housewife and
Hmm.
produce babies for her well-to-do husband.
Yeah.
Uh, and so she has to navigate that world.
Hmm.
Uh,
Well, I'm not a young woman, but I do like fantasy, so I might check it out.
I do too. Yeah, I love a good fantasy novel, and you know, even if it's a fantasy novel targeted toward young adults, like Hollow Earth is another good one. That's a
Hmm.
lot of fun. Uh, Maybe I just love that one because it takes place in Scotland, but I don't know. But yeah, fantasy's a lot of fun. And that was a big debate that we had at the conference whether we should encourage asexuality in asexual representation in the genre of uh, sci-fi and fantasy, because the argument was this is not the real world. Like
Hmm.
these are things that cannot exist in the real world. So if we couple asexuality to that, and we get lots of asexual representation in fantasy and lots of asexual representation in sci-fi, does that translate to people getting that same level of empathy toward asexuals in the real world? My argument was that representation is representation, and I'll take it.
Yeah.
I'd love to have, uh, you know, ace characters in, you know, a more real world drama. But if an author wants to write an ace character in a superhero comic book, I'll take it. I'd be happy to take that.
Well, I
Uh,
think from my perspective, I grew up on sci-fi and fantasy, and that's the majority of what I've read. So if you just I'm not if there's just loads of representation in like real life books or like non-fiction books or whatever, I'm not going to see it. Someone like me isn't going to see it.
Yeah,
So
because it's tough to not. I think getting representation across the board is great.
of course, yeah.
And personally, I love sci-fi and fantasy too.
Mm.
I'm not one of those academics that demeans the genres as being less than, although that does occur. And that's
Yeah.
another obstacle that you kind of have to overcome if you're trying to focus asexual representation in sci-fi and fantasy, is that some of these academics are going to look at the work and say, well, it's sci-fi, it's not real art. That's nonsense. And
Yes.
that notion is slowly disappearing, but it's still there. Like you can, that professor that laughed me out of the classroom because I wanted to do a paper on an anime, that attitude does still exist.
Yeah.
But it is going away, and that's a positive thing. So yeah, the representation in fantasy and the representation in sci-fi, that goes a long way. Like I personally would credit my love of X-Men comic books and Star Trek: The Next Generation as a kid to me being so open-minded of other people and other cultures.
Yeah.
So it does go a long way. Another character I think people probably are more aware of is, and I am positive I am going to butcher this name, so I apologize, is Anyaras from Les Mis.
I haven't.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but he is very much so, I think, an asexual character. I wouldn't call him a romantic, because he does seem to have he takes what we would consider a romantic relationship with a significant other, and he transfers that to France. He has a love of his country. In fact, when people are talking about why they're fighting in this revolution, and they're well, I'm fighting to protect my love, and they mention all the girls that they're in love with, and they get to Onyoras. I still feel like I'm saying that wrong, but they get to him, and he's like, well, my love is France, basically, and it's just he's an interesting case study. And then probably the most common example for a good aromantic character in literature prior to the Kinsey studies would be Dorian Gray.
Right.
He is certainly not asexual. Far from it. But he, I think, is most definitely a romantic. He doesn't seem to have any romantic attachment to any of the characters in the novel. In fact, he kind of mocks the notion that you would romantically be involved with someone in a lot of ways. So he's a good example of an aromantic character if we wanted to start kind of jumping into the area of aromanticism and that sort of spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's an aromantic allosexual person is valid, of course, but probably a bit harder for our society to stomach.
Well, there's this notion that he's just an allosexual aromantic is it's slut shaming is what it is.
Yeah,
it's they say, well, you are sleeping with these people and there's no romantic attraction whatsoever. You'll sleep with anything that moves, and it's preposterous, and it's just slut shaming at its finest.
Yeah.
I try and avoid that sort of thing, particularly when you're doing research like this, because you want to maintain as objective a point of view as possible.
Yeah.
And saying, oh, well, Dorian Gray is just a slut is just it's a nonsense, prejudicial talking point that you're gonna end up tainting your research by doing something like that.
Yeah, and it's taking a very complicated nature of sexuality and romanticism and boiling it down into a four-letter derogatory term,
Yeah.
which isn't the best thing.
No, no, and you don't want your audience feel denigrated by your work. So I don't want someone to an allosexual, asexual. So if I were to write about Dorian Gray and call it, well, he's just a slut. He's not really aromantic, or he's just sleeping around. My reader, whoever's reading this essay or whatever, who might happen to be allosexual and asexual, as rare as that might be, they would feel denigrated by that, and that's not something you want as an author of anything, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, whatever. You don't want to make your reader feel bad unless you're sending a really hateful text message or something.
Yeah. There's any more on your list?
Well, no more characters, but I do have two authors that are kind of interesting. Langston Hughes and Forrest Reed. I don't know if you're familiar with their work.
Langston Hughes rings a bell, but author, I forget names all the time.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, they both kind of have this sort of nebulous clout around them. They don't necessarily have a sexual history per se. They don't necessarily have a romantic history that's particularly easy to analyze. So when I say it's difficult to analyze a fictional character, it's much more difficult to analyze a real person.
Yes.
Because a biographical life is not self-contained. There are going to be aspects of Langston Hughes's life that I will never be able to know anything about. That being said, there's some reason to believe that he may have been asexual. But I don't like, personally, to speculate about people's sexual orientation. I think that's it's a dangerous habit to get into. So I'm trying to avoid speculating about an author's sexual orientation in research. But that being said, there could be an argument to be made that these are asexual authors. And if that's the case, then we can then read their works, which are not necessarily asexual in and of themselves. I mean, Langston Hughes was a poet, and his work doesn't necessarily coalesce with an asexual narrative, but we could read his work through the lens of asexual literary theory, which might reveal some new things, similar to if we read his work through the lens of African American literature, right? Because he was African American, so we could do that and discover new aspects, new dimensions of that work. But all the while underscored by that speculation that may or may not be true, which is why it's it's a little dangerous. So I try and avoid it. But in this case, these two authors do seem to exhibit some form of asexuality. They're somewhere on that spectrum, I'd say.
Okay. Yes, very interesting. Thank you for sharing them. And well, if you send me the link, and I can throw it in the description of whichever video this is. So then the people who are interested can check that out as well. But yes, now
I post updates on my PhD research and things like that. Not too frequently, but frequently enough. that they can check it out. And if they wanted to look at some of my books, I've got those posted there. I've got one that's free they can look at. There's a lot on the website to kind of take in and explore.
Yeah, I'm sure people will find that interesting. I'll probably check it out later once I've had some lunch. But yes, I think we've been going for quite a while now.
It doesn't feel like it, but yes, I suppose so.
It's been an hour and a quarter. I've got a little timer on the recording thing, so I can probably cut this up into 3 videos, I'd say, and then post those because I don't want to give myself an hour and 15 minutes of editing in 1 week, because that probably won't have to.
Understandable. Yeah.
Probably won't have to edit much, but I don't think people really want to watch an hour. Well, they might do. Not a lot of people want to watch an hour in one go. But yes, is there anything else you'd like to plug or say before we go?
Not that I can think of. Just if you're interested, check out the website. It has a nice comment section. If you can think of any asexual characters, I would love to hear about them. Because the more that I get, more commentary I get in, the more I hear about it. So the Avon forum boards, for example, have been just a tremendous resource at finding some asexual characters and kind of digging into them a little bit. Any help that anyone would be willing to provide, I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I'm very receptive. Yeah.
Cool. So if that's all, then thank you very much for coming on and talking. It's been great to talk about it. I could probably talk about this for hours as well, but I'm really hungry. So yes. I'm not very good at ending videos.
That's all right. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And if you ever want to do another video, I'd be happy to join.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll structure something a bit better next time. This is a bit ad hoc, but yes. Cool.
All right. Well, have fun at lunch.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this and want to see the other parts of the interview, I'll be putting the other videos in the description and in a playlist. So if you want to watch the whole of it, then feel free. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like. I post videos every Saturday, so if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. That is all I had to say today. Have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time.